What I want to do with Frankenstein films as an example is to outline a perspective on the cultural work of serially staged characters. I'll structure my argument around the three terms media crisis, serial chains, and the mediation of change. First, media crisis refers to an experiential crisis of sorts faced by media users who are unaccustomed to a new medium or medial form. Tales of early film viewers allegedly frightened by images of oncoming trains give us a somewhat exaggerated sense of this sort of crisis. As another example, recent work on the transition from silent to sound film has shown that sound didn't initially enhance the reality effect of film, or make it easier for viewers to relate to characters on screen, but instead fascinated and alienated viewers who often perceive talking actors as ghostly and less real than their silent film counterparts. Viewers' attention was drawn away from the story and towards the newly installed loudspeakers. Media crisis, in the sense I'm using the term, is a phenomenological crisis, and it occurs when habituated media relations are disrupted so that the medium loses its transparency, calls attention to itself, and problematizes the relations between perceiving subjects and mediated objects. The second term, serial chains, is related to the first by way of a special type of narrative character, which I call the serial figure. These are stock characters who appear again and again in a wide variety of adaptation forms, contexts, and media. They're generally presented as flat and repeatedly experience what Umberto Eco has called a virtual beginning with each new production. Narratively discontinuous, their seriality is constituted by the series of stagings and restagings that they undergo over time. Frankenstein's monster is a serial figure, as are Tarzan, Dracula, Sherlock Holmes, Superman, and Batman, to name a few. These characters move lightly and often between various media in the course of their careers, undergoing significant transformations in the process. In the move from literature to film, for example, the monster's narrative history is revised from the ground up, but his mediality is even more significantly at stake. In the 1930s, the monster becomes excessively visual, photographic, and this visuality is heightened by the monster's muteness. This monster foregrounds the medium of film, including the still problematic image-sound relations of the early sound cinema. So the iconic image is an index of media transformation, and it implies a medially self-reflexive dimension in which the monster's past lives as a literary, theatrical, or silent film figure are juxtaposed and contrasted with one another. Changes in media and the experiential media crises of which I spoke a moment ago therefore accrue upon serial figures in a snowballing accumulation of medial materialities, constituting serial chains that span the transitions and gaps between various media and medial forms. This brings me to the third key term, the mediation of change. As we've seen, the monster tends to problematize media, to make them opaque as objects of interest in their own right. The creation scene is typically a display of cinematic as much as diegetic technologies of creation. It shows off the state-of-the-art in cinema's arsenal of techniques for animating, or giving life to, lifeless photographic images. The monster thus oscillates between two frames of reference, the narrative frame of the diegesis and the extra-diegetic frame of a media-technological meta-narrative. And this oscillation resonates with the transitional phenomenological experience of the viewer or media user in the context of a media crisis. On the basis of this correspondence, serial figures like the monster can establish a sort of dialogue with the spectator on the subject of media change. They become mediators in the legal or paralegal sense of middlemen or go-betweens who help media users to gauge and negotiate media changes and attendant experiential crises. Schematically, the serial figure vacillates between its diegetic expression and its extra-diegetic mediality, thus splitting attention between the narrative and the conditions of its medial framing. This corresponds to the split attention and figure ground reversals typical of the viewer's experience of media crisis and instability. The figure and the viewer are thus able to encounter one another at a middle altitude, in an intermediate space where dialogue can take place on the historical conditions and transitional fluctuations that give rise to media crisis. Take, for instance, Thomas Edison's Frankenstein from 1910. Which stands between the early image technology-oriented cinema of attractions and the coming narrative-oriented classical Hollywood style that would take shape around 1917. In 1910, the medium was in transition, torn between lowbrow technological spectacle and an uncertain reorientation along the lines of the respectable theater. Accordingly, advertising for the film emphasized both the, quote, photographic marvel of the creation sequence, as well as the story's origin in Mrs. Shelley's work of art. The film aimed to be both technological spectacle and narrative high culture, and this multiple address informs the scope of the monster's mediating activities. The so-called marvel of the creation scene is produced by projecting footage of a burning mannequin in reverse. It's a bit of cinematic magic that, in the context of early film, served to exhibit cinematic technology by foregrounding the images over the objects they depict. Frankenstein's reactions here channel the scopophilic pleasure of a so-called primitive viewer, for whom he stands in as a proxy. Importantly, animation here is a self-reflexive topos, which links the monster's creation with the term animated photography, still common in 1910 as a description of film in general. However, the final showdown ambivalently signals a change of course towards narrative integration. The Edison Company claims that the scene communicates the story's moral, that love conquers all. But given the self-reflexivity of the creation sequence, Frankenstein's battle with the monster is also a battle with the medium of film as an animating technology, especially since trick effects are essential to the staging of the conflict. The mirror functions here like the projection surface of the cinema screen, where the images in the mirror are themselves flickering filmic images. The result is a film within the film, and Frankenstein is again a film viewer, but one struggling against the primitive type of reception he exemplified in the creation sequence. Now reformed, he stops staring at the specular surface of the medium as he learns to look through rather than at the mirror. He can finally focus on his environment, which, for us, is the world of the diegesis. In the context of the cinema's transitional phase, the film's narrative development is linked to a larger, non-diegetic narrative of filmic development. Frankenstein's psychological maturation allegorizes a historical normative process of cinematic maturation towards a proto-classical relation to film. But because monster's self-reflection is essential to its staging, the allegory remains incomplete. The monster may have been conquered on the level of the diegesis, and his defeat is structurally reproduced at the higher abstract level of the media historical meta-narrative. But the monster nevertheless survives at the middle, medial level, the level of mediation. For the supposedly integral diegesis of the film, whose closure Frankenstein achieves in overcoming his technology-oriented fascination, and therefore also the higher-order story or history of medial development that champions such closure and integrity, both of these narratives are dependent upon the radical non-closure of the recursive self-reflexivity which the monster as mediator embodies. As a mediator, the monster confronts viewers with the still germinal alternatives between primitive and classical modes of spectatorship, channeling the crisis situation of medial transitionality by constructing a serial chain that ambivalently brings the stakes of a media historical turning point into view.